Good morning. Praise God. We're reading from Philippians 2, verses 19 through 30. I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, so that I too may be cheered by news of you. For I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. For they all seek their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with a father he has served with me in the gospel. I hope therefore to send him just as soon as I see how it will go with me. And I trust in the Lord that shortly I myself will come also. I have thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister to my need. For he has been longing for you all, and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill. Indeed, he was ill, near to death. But God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. I am the more eager to send him, therefore, that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious. So receive him in the Lord with all joy and honor such men. For he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me.
Thank you, Al. So I want you to imagine here for a moment that I have a stove up here, a stove top, and I take out a pot, fill it with water, put it on the stove, and I heat it up until it's boiling. And then I take a live frog, and I place the live frog in the boiling water. Now, what do you think is going to happen when I put the live frog in the boiling water? He's going to jump out. That's exactly right. Now, I want you to imagine for a moment that I start over here. So I got my stove. I take a pot. I fill it with room temperature water. I put the frog in the water, and then I put the pot on the stove and heat it up. Guess what? No, I've never tried this. Don't try this at home. But I've heard that the frog oftentimes will not realize what's happening. And the water will get warmer and warmer and warmer and warmer until gradually the frog is cooked. I'd like to suggest that for reasons that will become clear as we move through this message, many of us are like that frog in the pot. Today we're continuing in our series called Finding Joy. We are good as a species at finding things. This is something I've been highlighting. We're good at finding things. Meteorologists are good at finding out how the weather's going to work. They're not perfect, but it seems like they get better all the time. I mean, their weather forecasts are a lot better than they were 20 years ago. They've been doing research, and they're finding out how weather works. We're good at finding things. I mentioned the Hubble telescope. For 30 years, it's been orbiting around our planet, finding things, finding planets and galaxies and quasars and black holes and what have you. We as a species, we're good at finding things, but there is one thing we are not good at finding, and that is joy. Right? I've mentioned throughout this series a study that was done that indicates that in the last 2 years, 1 out of every 3 Americans has experienced some form of depression, some form of depressive symptoms. And so what we're doing over these 9 weeks is we are exploring finding joy. And what I want to encourage you to do is I've encouraged you to invite your friends, tell your friends. And one of the things you can do is if you have some sad friends, I would encourage you to refer them to our website. And I think we have the slide here. Okay, yeah. So this here is our website. And what you'll notice is that in the top right corner, there is a tab that says Sermon Audio. And if you click on that, so here we go, Brian, go to the next one. it'll go to this sermon, or actually sermon video, excuse me. Sermon video, you'll go there, and we've started posting these sermons, the videos of these sermons, on our website. And so an easy way to invite a friend is say, hey, just check out this video. Sometimes some folks may be a little nervous to come to church that they're unfamiliar with. Well, just send them the link, and I think this series is a great place to start. So we want to encourage you to do that. Again, we want to end up filling our pews with sad people so that we can all explore how to find joy together. And, of course, where are we looking to find joy? Well, we are looking at the book of Philippians, the book from which Al read just moments ago. And why are we doing this? Because, as I keep saying, the book of Philippians is dripping with joy. If you were to tear the pages of Philippians out of your Bible, which I don't recommend, but if you were to and you were to wring them out, do you know what would drip out? Kind of like if you were wringing out a wet rag. What would drip out of those pages is joy. This book is just dripping with joy. So we are exploring joy and how we can find it, and we're finding different ways each week as we look at these different passages. And as we come to this passage, I think it's very simple what emerges from this passage, and it's this. We can find joy in others. We can find joy in others. Now, there's a similarity, no doubt, from this message to last week's message. Those of you who were here last week will know that last week's message was about finding joy in unity, finding joy in harmonious relationships. And there we talked about how nothing sucks the joy out of life quite like disunity. Nothing sucks the joy out of life quite like conflict in your relationships. So if you want to experience joy, you want to have harmonious relationships. Here what we're talking about is just the intrinsic joy that can be found in others. Yes, you need to be united. You need to be harmonious. Yes, that's for sure. But just the relationship itself, the concept of being in relationship with other people is a source of joy. And we find this in this passage. What emerges, I think, when you kind of look at what's going on in this passage, really what we get in the passage that was just read is a snapshot of the early church. We get a glimpse of what the early church was like. And what we discover is that the early church relationships were absolutely central to everything that they were. Relationships was the key to the foundation of the early church. And we have to remember that this was a time when there were no church buildings, right? They didn't have church buildings. They would meet in people's homes. Actually, we discover that it seems the Apostle Paul met a woman, Lydia, who became prominent in the early church. It seems like they might have met outside the city limits of Philippi, like by a tree or something like that, where there was a place where the early Christians would gather to pray. And so what we discover is that what made the church was the people, right? You've all heard that, this is the church, this is the steeple, open the doors where the people, or you do it this way, right? This is the right way. This is the church, this is the steeple, open the doors. Where are the people, right? The people are what make the church. Relationships, being in relationship with others is where we can find joy. And again, so we find this in this passage. We find how central relationships are to the church in a number of different ways. We see it in Paul and Timothy. We see Paul and Timothy's relationship, a snapshot of it, right? Verse 21, he says, "But you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with a father he has served with me in the gospel." Isn't that interesting how he refers to Timothy as if he is his son, as if Paul is his father? And so what we see here is actually just an example of, throughout the New Testament, how the early church would often refer to one another as family members, even though they weren't family. We discover, for example, actually, if I'd had Al read one more verse, if he had gone on and read verse 1 of chapter 3, which I didn't have him do because we'll have it read next week. But if I had, this is how it starts. It says, "Finally, brothers," chapter 3, verse 1. That when he's referring to the church, he refers to them as brothers. And we find this throughout the scriptures, that the church family is referred to as brothers and sisters. Actually, in the book of Acts, the word brothers, in the book of Acts, if you don't know, really just kind of chronicles the story of the early church. And in the book of Acts, 47 times the word brothers is used to refer to the faith community. Brothers and sisters, we find Apphia and Phoebe. These are two women in the church who Paul refers to as sisters. So there's this this kind of cultural way in which they approached their relationships, where they would refer to one another as family. And of course, in Western society, there are pockets of culture that do that still do that, refer to one another as brother and sister and that sort of thing. And of course, the reason for that is because of the influence of Christianity on Western culture. In the ancient Roman world, the time in which Paul is writing, the birth of the church, that was weird. That was just weird. I remember reading, and I can't remember where I read it, but I was reading some non-Christian from the first century commenting on how, he's like, it's so weird. These Christians refer to one another as brother and sister when they're not even related. Right? That was weird. But they did this because it shows just how central relationships were to them. So we see that in Paul's relationship with Timothy. We see it in Paul's relationship with Epaphroditus. Right, I love this in verse 25. He sort of describes his relationship with Epaphroditus as having multiple dimensions. He says, I have thought it necessary to send you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier and your messenger and minister to my need. Right, 5 different ways of describing sort of the relationship that Epaphroditus has with him and with the church. Right, just this thick, deep relationship with multiple layers. And then Timothy's relationship with the church. In verse 20, Paul is talking about Timothy, and this is what he says about Timothy. He says, for I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. Timothy cares about the church in Philippi. We see Epaphroditus' relationship with the church. Speaking of Epaphroditus, Paul says, for he has been longing for you and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill. And we're going to come back to this later on in the message. I love that he was distressed, that they were distressed that he was ill. So he's ill, and he's distressed because he knows they're distressed, right? That there's just this thick kind of relationship that they have. Then Paul's relationship with Epaphroditus. Indeed, he was ill, near to death, but God had mercy on him. And not only on him, but also on me, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. Here we see the depth of Paul's relationship with Epaphroditus, right? So again, we see throughout this how important relationships were to the early church. Now, of course, what emerges? What emerges from these deep relationships? Joy. Joy is what emerges from this. Verse 19. I hope in the Lord to send Timothy to you soon so that I may be cheered by news of you. Paul knows that just hearing about how the church in Philippi is doing is going to bring him joy. That's the depth of his relationship. He just wants to hear about how they're doing, and that will be a source of joy for him. Verses 28 through 29. Here speaking of Epaphroditus, here he's talking about Epaphroditus. I am the more eager to send him, therefore, that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious. So Epaphroditus, what happened? I'll come back to this. Epaphroditus came from the city of Philippi, and he came to Paul. Paul's in prison. There's debates about where he was, Rome, Ephesus, but whatever. Epaphroditus comes to Paul in prison on behalf of the Philippians to care for Paul. Somewhere along the way there, Epaphroditus gets ill and almost dies, and so the church in Philippi is, of course, worried about him. That's sort of the context here, but he's saying, I'm going to send him back to you, and look what he says. So receive him in the Lord with all joy. He knows that because of the depths of their relationship, joy is possible, right? We can find joy in others. The beginning of the letter sets the tone for this theme. If we go back to chapter 1, verses 3 through 5, right when he's kind of kicking off this letter, he says this, speaking of the church in Philippi, he says, I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, for you all, making my prayer with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. We can find joy in others. Now, one thing, just sort of as a side note, that I want to highlight, because you might have noticed this, you might have seen something in this here. Something that emerges when we look at the relationships that are described in this passage is a particular point emerges, and that's this. Joy in others comes with a risk. there's a risk, okay, to finding joy in others. And again, we see this emerges in verse 27. I've already read this, so you may have noticed this. Paul, talking about Epaphroditus, says, "Indeed, he was ill, near to death, but God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but also on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow." So notice this, what he's saying is his relationship with Epaphroditus is so strong that if Epaphroditus didn't come through, he would be deeply sad. But you see, that's the risk. There's a risk. The joy that is found in relationship with others, there is a risk because relationships can go south. Relationships, somebody can move, there can be conflict, a person can pass away. Right? There's risk in finding joy in others, but I think here's the point here, and I think maybe Paul's relationship with Epaphroditus serves as an example of something that you've heard for sure, and that's this. It is better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all. It's better to have taken that risk. It's better to have sought joy in others and then perhaps dealt with the hardship of loss or breakup, whatever. It's better to do that than to not engage in relationships. Because the joy that can be found in others, it's worth it. It's worth the risk. Joy can be found in others. Okay. So the question then becomes, all right, how do we find joy in others? How do I find joy in others? What does it mean to find joy in others? And I want to highlight 3 principles for finding joy in others, and then a 4th one will kind of emerge from that. Here's the first one. The first one is this: pursue people, not things. This is sort of a restatement of the idea that joy is found in others, but highlights it from a particular angle. If you want to find joy, pursue people, not things. See, here's the problem, is that many of us, when we look for joy, we pursue joy in things, not in people, right? Here we go. We pursue joy. We think this is joy. The double showcase winner. We think that's joy right there. Look at that. She won both those showcases. I mean, that's joy in it. I mean, that's what we like about joy. And, well, here's another one. Joy, success. Success, right? We look for joy in things, in money and success. But the reality is, and I think we all know this, the kind of joy that can be found in things, in material blessings and success, it just scratches the surface. It doesn't promise a deep joy. It scratches the surface of joy, but it can never really get you there. And if you pursue things rather than people, you'll never truly find joy. So there was an article that came out, this is a number of years ago actually, in the Washington Post, and it was commenting on research that was done about where you can find joy. And let me just read you. This is what it says here about, it's answering the question, where do you find joy? And where do you find joy? Okay, here it is. A good education? Sorry, mom and dad. Neither education, nor for that matter, a high IQ paves the road to happiness. Youth? No. Again, in fact, older people are more consistently satisfied with their lives than the young, and they're less prone to dark moods. So what makes us happy? Money? No. Education? No. Youth? No. Friends? A giant yes. The study done at the University of Illinois found that the most salient characteristics shared by the 10% of students with the highest levels of happiness and the fewest signs of depression were their strong ties to friends and family and commitment to spending time with them. Joy is found in others. So, one of my favorite books is a book by C.S. Lewis called The Great Divorce. And in that book, C.S. Lewis, he paints a fictional account of heaven and hell to try to kind of, draw out some qualities to help get us thinking about heaven and hell. So it's a fictional account, not meant to be taken literally, but it's a fictional account of heaven and hell. And in it, there's tourists on a bus, okay? And they have the opportunity to tour both heaven and hell. And when they're touring hell, what they discover about hell is that hell is a place where the people in hell just keep moving farther and farther and farther away from one another. And that the longer they're there, the farther out they are. So like Napoleon, for example, lives in a mansion millions of miles away from everybody else, actually just kind of pacing back and forth, stewing and over his battle mistakes, right? But just they can't. The longer they're there, they just can't be around other people. So it's like he's painting this picture of hell as isolation. Remember that sound? That is the sound of joy being sucked out of your life. And we've talked about throughout this series many different things that can suck the joy out of your life. And then another one emerges here. Nothing sucks the joy out of life like loneliness. Nothing sucks the joy out of life like loneliness. Now, I do want to say there's a difference between loneliness and being alone. Being lonely and being alone are not necessarily the same thing. You know, you can be alone, and I mean, being alone can be good sometimes. I mean, I'm an introvert, to be honest with you. I like being alone sometimes. I find joy in being alone. That's not the same thing as being lonely, right? I mean, you can be lonely and be in a crowd. You can be surrounded by people and be lonely. So in other words, loneliness is a social, not a physical state. Right? Being alone is a physical state. You're either alone or you're not. But loneliness is a social state, and it's when there isn't social connection. Now, here's what's interesting. We've been highlighting throughout this series how Americans tend to be very depressed. 1 out of 3 have suffered depression in the last couple of years. But here's also what the research shows, and we shouldn't be surprised by this. Americans are lonely. Drawing on the same article from the Washington Post, listen to what it says here. It says, Americans are this is written, I don't know, about 10 years ago, and I think it's only gotten worse. Americans are far more socially isolated today than they were 2 decades ago. And a sharply growing number of people say they have no one in whom they can confide, according to a comprehensive new evaluation of the decline of social ties in the United States. A quarter of Americans say they have no one with whom they can discuss personal troubles, more than double the number who were similarly isolated in 1985. Robert Putnam, Harvard professor and author of the book Bowling Alone, a book about growing social isolation in America, says, for most of the 20th century, Americans were becoming more connected with family and friends, and there was more giving of blood and money, and all of those trend lines turned sharply in the middle 60s and have gone in the other direction ever since, he said. Research done by George Gallup concludes that as many as 1/3 of Americans admit to frequent periods of loneliness. Gallup concludes Americans are among the loneliest people on earth. And I think it's interesting, isn't it? Did you notice it says that 1/3 of Americans admit to periods of loneliness? That's the exact same percentage from the other study that have experienced depression. So we see that there is a very strong connection between connection with others, and finding joy. So, summing it all up, folks, where do we find joy? How can I find joy? And how can I find joy in others? What does that mean? Well, it means finding joy in people, not things. So not money. We don't want to find it in money. Want to find it in money? There we go. Thank you, Brian. Can't find it in success? No, you know where you can find it? People. Pursue it in people, especially people who dress up like the Easter Bunny. Thank you, Al, for that. That's beautiful. Okay. Joy is found in others. So we should pursue people, not things. Secondly, if we want to find joy in others, we should pursue different levels of social involvement. A book came out a number of years ago called The Search to Belong. And it talks about how social health, a person who is socially healthy, will experience social health in a number of different levels. There's different levels of social engagement. And he talks about 4 different social spaces. There's public space, social space, personal space, and intimate space. And so as you might imagine, public space is, crowds of people. And social space is, well, okay, so public space might be, like going to a football game or something. Just yesterday, Laura and I are part of the Send Network. It's a part of it's a movement of church planters and replanters, and so they had an event where we went to the Colorado Rapids game, right? And so you're sitting in a crowd with, I don't know, thousands of people, but there's social ties there because you're all rooting for the same team. And when the other team cheats, you're all yelling together, and there's a camaraderie. Like, I don't even know you, but man, we are just bonding right now because we're so mad, right? There's a social bond that happens at a public level. So that's public. Then there's social, and a social space is more like just a party you go to, and you get to know. You just kind of have small talk with people. One of the things this book talks about is that small talk is not necessarily a bad thing. Like, small talk is an important part of healthy social development. Whether you like it or not, it's actually pretty important. And so being in an environment where you just kind of have small talk, but you're talking with people, getting to know them, that's a social space. Then personal space. Personal space. Now, these are people you're really getting to know. This is a smaller group of people with whom maybe you're beginning to do life with, right? Share life with, that sort of thing. A smaller group of people. And then intimate space, that's just, one or two folks with whom you're very open and vulnerable. And what this book highlights is that we need all of these different social levels of involvement in order to experience social health. What I think is interesting is that you find Jesus operating at all of these different levels. Right? So we see Jesus, feeding the 5,000. He's out with the crowds. We see Jesus at the social level. Jesus was actually kind of a party animal. Jesus was always going to parties, always hanging out with people, going to people's house for dinner, interacting with lots of different people at sort of that social level. Then the personal level, he's got the 12 disciples with whom he shared life with, did life with. And then it even seems like Peter, James, and John were at that intimate level. He had an even deeper relationship with those three. So we see the importance of all three levels of social involvement. And they are important. I think in our American individualistic society, we tend to really emphasize the sort of intimate relationship, which, of course, it is important for sure. But I think the reality is we sometimes emphasize the intimate, that close friend, maybe too much. In fact, I would suggest this might even be one of the reasons why in America marriages often struggle, is I would suggest that we might actually put too much weight on our marriages to meet our social needs. That we expect so much out of our marriage, that when it doesn't go the way we expect it, well, then that causes conflict in the marriage. Well, the problem may be that we're putting too much social expectation on the marriage to meet those needs. And so I think of this story. There's a story in the Bible which just shows how different the culture in which Jesus grew up in was. And it's the story where Jesus is 12 years old, and his family, they go to Jerusalem for the Passover feast. And they're coming down from Galilee. It's probably a several-day journey down to Jerusalem. They go to the Passover feast, and then they're coming back, right? And here's what the Bible says. It says that after a day, Mary and Joseph realized that their 12-year-old son wasn't with them. You're on a trip, and you don't realize your son isn't with you for a whole day? I mean, like the helicopter parent, is like, what? Oh, man, call social services. Mary and Joseph, they should not be allowed to have Jesus with them. Okay, well, what's going on here? Well, they lived in a very different culture where they lived life in community. And so when they were going on this journey, it wasn't just, them in their minivan going down to Jerusalem. They were with friends and relatives and friends, probably a large group of people all traveling together and traveling back. And they kind of shared those parenting burdens of their children. And so, it was actually pretty normal for them to not, he's probably with, Aunt Betsy or with whoever it is, off with somebody. And so that's why. And so what it just shows is that they didn't put all of their they didn't expect the marriage and the family unit to meet all of their social needs. So we need to be able to engage at all of these different social levels. And to this point, I would even then say, Facebook is not bad. Facebook can be. Facebook can be a way of connecting with one another. The problem is when that becomes your primary form of social involvement, now it cannot carry the social weight that you need it to carry. So it can play a role, but when we start letting social media dominate our kind of community, it'll never meet those needs. We need to meet them at all of these different levels. Okay, so joy is found in others. So we should pursue people, not things. And we should pursue different levels of social involvement. And thirdly, we should aim to give more than receive in our relationships. We should aim to give more than receive in our relationships. You know, there are some relationships that we have that just by virtue of the nature of the relationship, it's really all about you receiving something. So, for example, I just got a new doctor, went to my doctor, and at this point, that relationship is entirely about me receiving from him. Maybe at some point we'll become friends, it'll become, I don't know. But at this point, it's all about me receiving medical advice from him, me receiving, prescriptions for medications. It's about me receiving, right? You know, my kids had a piano teacher for years, and we got to know her a little bit, but the truth was that relationship was basically just about us receiving musical instruction. Okay, so here's the point. If your relationship, there are relationships like that, but you will never truly find joy in that kind of relationship. I mean, my kids, found joy in learning to play the piano. That's different. But the relationship itself, you'll never find joy in a relationship which is about you receiving. Genuine joy is not possible. That actually, and this is what's so counterintuitive, genuine joy in others is found when you aim to give more than receive. And this is what we discover. I think we see that even in the passage that Al read, that in the early church there was this high priority on giving rather than receiving. Again, going back to our passage, talking about Timothy, Paul's talking about Timothy and Timothy's relationship with the church in Philippi, and he says in verse 19, that he's genuinely concerned for them. He's genuinely concerned, and he says that's different than other people who just look out for their own interests. He compares Timothy's genuine concern for the church in Philippi with those who just look out for their own interests. Epaphroditus, as I already mentioned, Epaphroditus, he was concerned that they were concerned, right? He's the one that's sick. He's the one that's about to die, and he seems to be distressed that they're distressed, right? It's about them. It's about him wanting to give to them. It's not about him receiving. Verse 30, Paul says that Epaphroditus risked his life for Paul. Risked his life for him. That for Epaphroditus, his relationship with Paul, he was thinking about it in terms of him giving and not receiving. We see Paul talks about his concern for the church. He says in the beginning of that passage, he talks about how he's going to send Timothy. He's going to send Timothy to Philippi, and the sole reason he's sending him there is so that he can bring news back to Paul about how they're doing. Paul just wants to know how they're doing. It's not about what he can get from them. He just wants to, because he cares about them. It's about giving and not receiving. Verse 23, he talks about how he hopes to go to them. He wants to go to them so that he can be with them and serve them and help them. And of course, this whole mindset of giving rather than receiving, the tone for this is really set, again, earlier in the letter when Paul says something quite remarkable. We've already looked at this, but here's what he says. So he's in prison. Paul's in prison, and he doesn't know if he's going to be executed or if he's going to be set free. So he's pondering what his life will look like if it goes either way. And this is what he says. He says, I am hard-pressed between the two options. Really. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. So he's saying, look, if it was about me, you think the truth is I'd almost be better off being executed because then I'd just be with the Lord, right? And then he goes on, he says, but to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith. So Paul, it's like he sees his only reason for existence is to give rather than to receive in relationships. And of course, what does this lead to? This leads to joy. This is what leads to joy when we aim to give rather than to receive. So my family, we have some family friends. When I was growing up, we met this family where The kids were the same age as myself and my brother, so we got along really well. And then their parents were the same age as my parents, and they really connected. And so when Laura and I were getting married, they came to the wedding, and I can't remember if it was at the wedding or before, but I was talking with Jim, the father, and he'd been married for many years, and I just had a lot of respect for him and just kind of observing his marriage. And so we were talking about marriage, and I asked him for some advice, and he said this. He goes, oh, well, he says, when you get up in the morning, just plan on doing at least 60% of the work in your marriage. He's like, at the end of the day, if you feel like you did more than she did, good. That's what you should be aiming to do. The percentage isn't all that important. His point was you should aim every day to end up doing more than your spouse. And if you do that, if you aim to give rather than receive, if that's your primary focus, then you will find joy. Of course, once again, how do we know, okay, that joy is found in giving rather than receiving? How do we know this? What is the foundation for this idea that joy can be found in giving rather than receiving? And of course, the answer is this. This is the approach that God took with us in Jesus. In the book of Acts, we read an account of, again, the Apostle Paul talking with a group of leaders from the church, a different church, a church in the city of Ephesus. And listen what he says. He says, in all things I have shown you that by working hard in this way, we must help the weak and remember the words of the Lord Jesus, how he himself said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. Jesus says, he tells us, it is more blessed. There's more joy. Blessed means happy. There's more joy in giving than in receiving. And of course, Jesus, he practiced what he preached. Matthew 20, verses 28, speaking of himself, he says, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Friends, the heart of the Christian faith is that in the person of Jesus, God himself sought to give rather than to receive. In fact, he gave to the point of death, giving himself completely on the cross for us, for our joy and for our deliverance. And that is the grounds on which we know that following in his footsteps and giving, seeking to give rather than receive, brings joy. Okay, bringing this all together. Joy is found in others in three ways we've seen. Pursuing people, not things. Pursuing different levels of relationship. And thirdly, aiming to give more than receive. So, I want to just put this out there for you. This summer, let's make this the summer of others. Can we do that? Let's make this the summer of others. Where do I have the? Yeah. Let's make this the summer of others. There we go. Let's make this the summer of others. There we go. Oh, I thought I had that in that slide. Whatever. Okay, maybe not. Okay. Maybe I just put that in my own notes. Summer Connect. Would love for you to fill this out. Let's find ways to get together. Doing something that you love to do. Fill this out. Let me know about it. I'll contact you and we'll try to put together some ways for all of us to connect because joy is found in others. So I started this message by having you imagine that I had a stove up here. And I told you that if you put a frog in boiling water, he'll jump out. But if you take a pot of water and you put the frog in it at room temperature and then start heating it up slowly, the frog won't even notice until it's too late. Friends, isolation is the same way. Isolation is the same way. Being alone, I mean, here's the thing about the pandemic. Like, being alone can be kind of fun. I mean, like, you don't have there's no burdens, no expectations. I can sit and watch TV all day. And I think we can kind of be lulled into thinking that this is the life. I mean, being isolated, it is like being put in a pot of room temperature water, and then it starts to heat up. And at first, it's like a jacuzzi, you know? This is nice. Ooh, I like being alone. Mm-hmm. But I'm just going to put this as bluntly as I can. If you do not intentionally seek out community, you will boil in the pot of your own solitude. We have to be intentional about seeking out community. And I say that I believe me, I'm speaking to myself as much as anybody because I'm naturally an introvert. So I have to be intentional. I like being alone, but I have found that if I let myself be alone too long, I'm like that frog in the pot, this is starting to burn. So we have to be intentional. And what I would suggest is that we have to be intentional about community to a degree that throughout history, most communities have not had to be as intentional. In other words, society has changed so much that community does not happen as naturally as it used to. And that actually emerged, if you saw in one of those articles that I read. It talks about how up until the 60s, community was being fostered and whatnot. But then he says in the 60s, everything started to turn in the other direction. Social ties started to fall apart. And I think there's a lot of different reasons for this. I think I can highlight two main reasons. I'm not a sociologist, but for what I've seen, I think it's quite interesting. One is the automobile became that much more present in people's lives. And so the automobile just takes us farther away from one another. There's just natural distance. And then the other one is you think about the 60s, that's when TVs, it's actually in the 50s when TVs started, but then in the 60s, they're everywhere. And so now it's just keeping people in their homes. Those are just two ways in which our society has changed such that community does not happen as naturally. So we have to be intentional about it. We have to be intentional because if you do not intentionally seek out community, you will ultimately boil in the pot of your own solitude. Friends, let's make this summer the summer of others because joy is found in others. We now come to our time of communion.